Hey everybody, happy Thursday and welcome to another TechstrongTV broadcast. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon. Today is Thursday, March 17th, and guess where I'm going to be in about 2 hours? Marching up Fifth Avenue in New York City. I am so excited. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody out there. We have a great lineup on today's show. We've got a lot of really fascinating conversations with some really interesting topics on today's show. And we are going to get things kicked off today with a conversation between Alan and Atif Ghari, who is the Chief Operating Officer over at Herjavec Group. Herjavec and Fishtech Group actually recently announced a merger, which is going to create an industry cybersecurity powerhouse, they say. It's got 600 security professionals around the world. So Alan and Atif talk about how the combined company is going to work, what its strengths are in the cybersecurity space, and so much more. This is a great merger, and it's good for both companies, and Atif and Alan talk about why that is. It's a great conversation. After that, we have a Haunted Hacker podcast. This is going to be a very fascinating one, folks. This is a conversation between host Mike Jones and Karen Stewart, who is a retired NSA analyst. She was with the National Security Agency for 28 years, and she's got a lot of stories to tell. So she and Mike talk about a lot of different things on the podcast, as always. But Karen also became a whistleblower on interagency corruption and physical attacks. And so this one is... This is more than just your usual, what do you think about cybersecurity conversation. She talks about government corruption and some of the conspiracy theories that are out there and whether they actually have a kernel of truth or not. This is, Mike said that this is one of those podcasts you really do want to pay closer attention to if you want to learn more about the inner workings of the government. And we've got it here for you. I hope you can join us for the entirety of that one. After that, we have got our Something Old segment. This is from the recent Predict 2022 event. This one features Martin Mao, who is the co-founder and CEO over Chronosphere. Martin has a presentation titled Observability Predictions for 2022. And guess what it's about, folks? Observability. So he talks about his top predictions for about open standards adoption, centralization of observability practices, and data growth. And 2022 seems to be a pivotal year in observability. So definitely want to check out this presentation as well. After that, I'm back with the news headlines, and then I have a great conversation with Jason Barris, who is the Senior Vice President of Developer Tools over at Infragistics. Now, Infragistics recently put out what is it? It's a software development survey, folks. It's about the top skills for software developers and some of the biggest challenges that are facing the software industry these days. The survey reveals that it is actually recruiting developers who have the right skills. And so Jason and I talk about how organizations can address these and other challenges effectively. This is definitely a conversation you want to listen to because if you are in the market for hiring software developers, you need to know what's out there and what you can do to make sure that you get the right developers on board. Great stuff. After that, I've got the webinar's preview for you. And then we close things out with The View with Vizard. And in this one, Mike Vizard is speaking with Blair Lyon. Blair is the Vice President for Cloud Experiences over at Linode, and Linode was recently acquired by Akamai for $900 million. And so Blair and Mike talk about the benefits that both organizations are reaping from this acquisition, how the technologies are going to complement each other, and how it's going to impact the industry at large. It's a great conversation. That's today's lineup, and we run the gamut on today's broadcast, and I hope you can join us for the entirety of it. And we are going to get things kicked off right after these commercial messages.
Looking for a live conference focused on the tools, technologies, and practices most important to your business? Innotech conferences are live one-day business and technology conferences highlighting the latest in trends for IT leaders, developers, and IT professionals. Each event combines education, innovation, peer-to-peer networking, and the latest technology and business solutions for a diverse IT-focused audience. Inotech conferences occur throughout the year in strategic regional locations, bringing together technology professionals from various industries to learn about the solutions, practices, and tools impacting their day-to-day work and gain insight into what's to come. Presenters at Inotech conferences are selected and curated to ensure each session provides the most up-to-date and relevant information without any hype. Whether you're interested in digital transformation, cybersecurity, cloud, IT leadership, or DevOps, Inotech conferences deliver. 2022 events are scheduled to be held in Austin, Dallas, Oklahoma City, Houston, and Washington, D.C. Inotech conferences are produced by TechStrong Live and powered by TechStrong Group.
All right, we are back. Kicking things off, we have a conversation between Alan and Atif Ghari, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Herjavec Group. Herjavec is recently, it announced that it recently acquired FishTech Group. It's actually a merger, which actually creates an industry powerhouse with more than 600 security professionals around the world. Alan and Atif talk about the merger, talk about the two groups together and what they're going to be able to bring to the market, and so much more. Great conversation. Let's go ahead and roll it now.
This is Digital Anarchist. With the pleasure of being joined by Atif Ghari. Atif is the Chief Product Officer with Herjavec Group. Good to be talking with you today, Atif.
My pleasure.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about Herjavec Group. I think we're going to go into that as well, but just tell us a little bit about the merged company, and then we'll get into kind of how this came together.
Yeah, so I've been with the company for since 2014, and very excited about what we've been doing in the market, and more importantly, just very recently, we announced a major acquisition and merger with FishTech, which is a extensive complementary offering for us around managed security service, which is the cornerstone of all that we do. So very excited about that. I am the head of product for the new company together, formerly the COO of Herjavec Group. And we have some extensive plans for what we're going to do moving forward to expand our managed services offerings, given this complementary acquisition merger.
Excellent. Well, if you've been in security for a while, you know FishTech and probably know Gary Fish. He's a longtime friend of Alan and mine, especially Alan. So, he's always well respected. So congratulations on the merger acquisition combination, whatever those are these days. Sometimes you can't tell how things roll out, but
yeah. It's Gary has been tremendous, a visionary in the field, started FishNet several years ago, and has gone on to found other companies as well, including FishTech. And Robert and Gary actually have been good friends. Robert Herjavec, CEO of Herjavec Group, have been good friends for close to 20 years. And so it was just a matter of time before they pulled together into one organization. And so it's the cultural fit couldn't be better for us.
Some things are inevitable. You just don't know it until it is, right?
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, congratulations on that. FishTech. I haven't said that word in a long time. And FishNet.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
We're excited to see. So, are you in the integration process, kind of sorting things out about how the services are going to complement each other and how that's going to work, or did you already kind of have a plan pre-merger? How's that going?
Yeah, we are mushing it together. No, in fact, it's given the complementary nature of the merger, it's been very fluid in that both of our organizations have been experiencing tremendous growth, especially towards the end of last year and going into this year. So our theme has been continue the momentum, and so almost operating, in a place where there are some synergies, but really just continuing the momentum what we're already doing. And given the complementary nature, which is why we conducted the merger acquisition, it's really been a fun, and we're still experiencing that growth, and we expect to have great earnings to report at the end of the quarter.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to that and other good news coming from Herjavec Group. Speaking of news, you've come out with your 2022 Cybersecurity Conversations report. Now, this is something, I don't know how long have you been doing this report? I assume you've done this before. I know it's come out years prior, right?
Absolutely. Several years we've been doing this, and our customers especially really appreciate it and look forward to it.
Interesting conversations report. We're always talking about security. Well, tell us some of the interesting things that have come out from this year's report.
Yeah, it's the dialogue around the report is focused on how we're seeing the cybersecurity landscape from an executive standpoint. And there's key themes there that tie back down to key engineering operations type of reports that the architects and the engineers also like to dig into. And the big themes in cybersecurity, I mean, if you watch the news, you see cybersecurity regularly, especially these days, given the activities across the Atlantic here in Russia. The capability for each organization to be agile. I think that's one of the key themes that come out of the report is being able to take the program and adjust based off of the types of changing apps, whether it's going from on-prem to cloud, or whether it's the state of the attacks that are coming into the network or onto the endpoint. So the agility of your security program, we cover that. And secondly, I would add on is visibility. So in 2022, especially, if you don't have visibility, you are in trouble, and that you can't stay ahead or even up with an attack if you don't know where you're being attacked. And where you've been attacked has now extended to Internet of Things and operational technologies, which before we talked about, but now it's in your face. And as you see in the reports from the media around different types of attacks that are actually being published. But what about the attacks that aren't published, right? And so we work in digital forensic incident response for many of our customers. And there's a lot more attacks out there and a lot more breaches that are happening that have not been publicly talked about yet. And so that the ability to have visibility is a key factor, another theme that came out of the report. And finally, I would say, the Boy Scout model, always be prepared. And the capabilities that you may have, the capabilities that you want to develop, those are an area that we talk about as well as what types of capabilities from a cybersecurity standpoint to continue to build on. I would say those are probably the three big themes, Alan.
Makes total sense, especially given, as you mentioned, what's happening internationally. It just kind of my opinion about things seems like we've moved past the era of, we better go back and get things shored back up. Right. I mean, yes, we've kind of gone through the whole COVID and rapid expansion, and we are sort of revisiting some of those things. But now, everybody's expected to be well protected and have the proper defenses in place. And as you mentioned, visibility, which is kind of a two-sided coin. There's visibility into what the attacks are, and the unknown unknowns, right, they're happening, but also where and what is being attacked, because security has to deal with, it's not just infrastructure in our data centers, not just cloud infrastructure, it's all the way through the application stack, third-party services, supply chain, software supply chain. It's a much broader landscape of visibility we need to have into the security posture.
That's right. Yeah, and we absolutely see that. And that extension and that visibility, it's often challenging, especially for mid-enterprise corporations and of course, large enterprise corporations as well, because of so you spend all this time, energy, tooling within your environment. What about your third parties? Mm-hmm. And are they doing the same level of due diligence? And, as a cybersecurity professional by trade, it's the weakest link that is what can make all things go wrong. And so security is only as good as the weakest link. And oftentimes that's the third parties and the third parties you do business with, and having their security infrastructure to a level that's, more equal to, if not more advanced than yours. And, organizations have adopted a zero trust model, which is easy said, zero trust than done, given the amount of controls required for your applications, for your end users. It's almost an overhaul for some organizations, again, go into zero trust model to adapt to the third party risk from vendors and external parties.
Yeah, some great points there too. I think we've come to the realization we knew all along that that shared risk model is not outsourced risk. It's still our risk. It's just someone else is responsible for making sure we don't have issues. But we're just because we've outsourced to a service or we use services, right? And I would imagine, especially in your business, that's an important thing to communicate with your customers, what that shared risk model really is and how you work together. Because breaches, attacks are going to happen. I'm not saying, you're going to be breached tomorrow, but we all are going to experience, incidents as well as, of course, attacks. And I think there's much more heightened sense to the role that service providers, SaaS applications, all of it play in the ecosystem of our software stack, if you want to think of that, our infrastructure stack.
Yeah, I'd say the key word is accountability. And, we're a partner for many of our for all of our customers. We try to be a partner versus a vendor. And, all partners will say that, well, we're going to take care of you. We're going to be there for when you need us. But what does that really mean from an accountability standpoint, right? And so we like to have those conversations. Sometimes they're uncomfortable, but they're direct to talk about, okay, what are we doing? What's our responsibilities? What have you really signed up for? So that way everyone is clear as to what type of responsibilities the service provider has versus what the customer has. And then let's figure out the gaps and address them, especially as your partner. As we're saying, we want to be a trusted partner. We can help you address those gaps, but let's make sure we have the right services, the right resources that are going to be tying that in so that when things do happen, because they're happening, that can bring something down or cause an outage, we all know who's on first and who's on second in order to get back and recover and operational again.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not just signing a contract or providing a credit card, because you also don't know sort of what the risks are on the other side that might be coming your way or affect the service that you're providing to them. I'm curious about zero trust. You mentioned people's adoption. We're in this adoption curve, maybe I think early, most people would say. And you mentioned rethinking security and the kind of controls that you need over software and applications. What are some of the lessons we've learned so far? Thinking, planning, architecting, and beginning to implement zero trust. Any thoughts you can share either from the report or your own experience at TIFF?
Yeah, we could talk about that. And you cited part of components in the report around zero trust as well. It's, zero trust is really born to cloud-led idea. Whereas in the cloud, you have a hypervisor, you have virtual machines. Some of them live for years, some of them live for minutes. And you have the ability to do more software-enabled security controls on the fly. And so with that, what we're seeing in the industry is adopting a zero trust model is a great enabler of that is cloud-based platforms, computing platforms. So if you have a workload that's moving to the cloud or even a set of workloads or whole department or her organization that's moving to the cloud, great time to architect a zero trust model. So you can, based off of different types of controls, whether it's through a multi-cloud approach or whether it's through hypervisor controls, whether it's through a cloud posture management solution, all of which we do for our clients as a managed service as part of our offerings, you can begin to build that zero trust model versus the traditional on-prem model where you have to rip and replace and tear things down. So as far as transition and adoption, the cloud, using the cloud journey to enable that is something that many organizations have had success with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, zero trust isn't a feature or a sticker on the outside that says Intel and zero trust inside.
Yeah. And for the folks that are just still learning about cybersecurity, watching, zero trust basically means that layer of security. And it's not just the castle with the walls around it that once you get past that wall, you're in the castle. Those days are gone. So it's just maybe hundreds of walls that are attached in the center of the data. That is the most prized possession, the crown jewels, versus one big wall on the border.
Yep. A great way to describe it. Well, given that report's called Conversations, what are some of the conversations security executives, security professionals should be having with senior management, executive board, other parts of the business that either we aren't having or we're starting to have more of?
Yeah, I would say the ransomware conversation is very real. And it's if many organizations have already been impacted by ransomware in one form or another, or a third party that it was ransomware, and they were indirectly hit by it. And so ransomware preparedness is a key topic, because this, in the past, if you look at cybersecurity as a whole, there's the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, availability of the foundations of cybersecurity. Availability, right? It's there, right? It's the A. And that is what's really being attacked. And so in the past, you may have like a grocery store or an organization that doesn't, says, oh, I don't really have any data. And so I don't need to invest so much in security. No, you can't say that anymore, because availability impacts everyone, right? The A in the CIA triad. And so how to address business continuity, disaster recovery, availability of systems is something that's top of the mind of executives, because why they could have dismissed the technical guys around technology and maybe cybersecurity in the past, they cannot dismiss a factory or a plant that's going to be shut down on availability that's going to impact your revenues and the number of widgets that are going to be produced. And so, the Colonial pipeline incident from last year, it was a great mini lesson within the larger issue that happened. Everyone's well aware of the Colonial pipeline attack, but people aren't as aware of the fact that the CEO of the Colonial pipeline was asked that, you had controls in place, you were able to recover because you had backup. So why did you pay the ransom? And you would think, okay, well, you have backup and you can recover. So why would you pay the ransom? So the answer that he said was that because I didn't know how they came in. And so therefore, they could do everything they want, but it could happen all over again, right? And so the lesson at the C-level to the executive team around availability is know your environment, have that visibility, have those controls in place. And, organizations like us as a managed security provider that prides itself on how we be able to detect, respond, and be able to enable the remediation of attacks, because we actually know how they came in based off the controls we deploy. That's something that's really you need. Either you need it in-house or you need a partner that can help you answer that question of how did they come in. Otherwise, you may be in the situation that poor CEO faced last year.
You never know if you're in the same situation and could happen all over again. I think it's a very wise question to ask, should be asked. So just one thing I wanted to get your opinion on, this is sort of just as an aside, one of the trends that people talk about and you start to see happening, I'm curious if you see this too, is the role of the CISO and the CIO, and those being combined in some cases. Sometimes it's CISO also takes over the infrastructure. Sometimes it's a full CIO job. Is that sort of an edge case exception? Is that a trend that you see starting to happen and building momentum, or is it really good for articles on websites, but not really happening in the real world?
I'll tell you, the importance of a CISO is more important than ever before. In the past, if anybody asked, well, we're paying the CISO all this money to lead the organization, but we have all these engineers that do this and these technicians that do that. Why do we need a CISO? He's just telling us whether. Well, the answer is pretty in our face these days. Especially, I could use a wartime analogy. So when things go down, you have tanks, you have fighter jets, you have submarines, you have all these different security controls, let's call it, right? Firewalls, endpoint detection. But which one do you deploy when and how? And how do you coordinate them together in order to accomplish your mission, right? And so it takes a CISO to do that, to be able to understand the different types of technologies that you have in play and how to deploy them, what layer goes between another. The engineers are brilliant and they're in the weeds on the keyboards, but they're not seeing that bigger picture, the general approach of overall cybersecurity controls and cybersecurity operations and cybersecurity architecture and governance. And that rests with the CISO. And so that role has become more important now than ever before, just given the complexity of the types of controls and applications of controls you can put in play.
Excellent. Thank you for your perspective on that. So the report, where can folks download that and start those conversations if they're not already having them?
Yeah, it's bright and center. And on our website, herdsgroup.com, fishtechgroup.com. You could download the report. There's a PDF version of it, and happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk more about what they've seen, any of the references we refer there. It's for cybersecurity professionals. It's a good recap things that need to be focused on in the year to come, and questions to ask your vendors as well around how they're helping you with accountability and security of controls as well.
Excellent. Very good. Well, Atif, welcome there. Thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back. Welcome to come back for 2023's report, but please come back in the interim and share some more with us what's happening with Herjavec Group and what exciting things are on the forefront.
It'll be my pleasure anytime. Thank you for the time today.
Great.
All right.
Thank you for talking with us.
ContainerJournal.com is the leading online destination for centralized computing-related content. ContainerJournal.com covers all aspects of software containers, from container management, data management for containers, container security, networking for containers, to the entire container ecosystem, Kubernetes, microservices, serverless, and more. ContainerJournal.com has the largest selection of container-related news, featuring breaking news, blog posts, podcasts, and more. Visit www.containerjournal.com to learn more.
All right, we are back. Next up, we've got the Haunted Hacker podcast. This one is a very, very interesting one. This one features host Mike Jones speaking with Karen Stewart, who was a retired NSA analyst, and later she became a whistleblower on interagency corruption and physical attacks. She talks about everything related to government corruption, conspiracy issues. It is a very fascinating conversation that they have, and really Mike encourages anybody who does listen to it with an open mind. He does pose the question, how much of the truth do you think we actually get as citizens from our own government? And this is a hot button issue for sure, a hot button conversation. So please stick around, listen to the whole thing. We're going to go ahead and roll it right now.
Welcome to the Haunted Hacker podcast, and this is February version 3.2. I've already done probably double the amount of podcasts for February that I usually do because I've had so many interesting guests. So a little bit of news before we get started. I'll be speaking in Atlanta on March 30th for the TechStrong event. I'll be giving a class on how to hack Android phones. And also to how to subvert security controls within mobile devices. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot of good news. Just still waiting on the brink to see what happens with Russia and Ukraine and see when we get slammed with infrastructure attacks with ransomware. So other than that, I don't have anything. And tonight we have Karen Stewart. She is a retired analyst from the NSA and a friend of a friend, Captain Zap, Ian Murphy, who is on the podcast many times so far. I talk a lot about him. So with that, Karen, I'll let you introduce yourself and kind of talk to us about, where you've been, what you've done, and your story.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being on. I've been trying for a handful of years to try to get this message out. I was an NSA whistleblower, and to not really belabor that too much, I discovered something that was criminal and very treasonous. And instead of acting on it and investigating, I got stalked, harassed, defamed, and fired. So I came to find out after that the NSA and other federal agencies, and I would imagine some of the bigger companies and things like that, use what is called a fusion center for vengeance for hire purposes. Now, what is a fusion center? In case you don't know, after 9/11, Congress demanded NSA, CIA, FBI, et cetera, tell them why in the world they missed the fact that 9/11 was going to happen. And they, I listened to a little bit of the testimony, and they were pretty much saying, oh, it's that pesky Constitution. We just, it just kind of wrecked things for everybody. And I'm just like, oh my God, And, so what they did was they said, hey, if we create fusion centers in every state where we can take representatives from FBI, CIA, NSA, DEA, whatever, put them in the same building with local law enforcement. Then we can fuse any type of intelligence that we get from the area, and then we'll be on top of things. Well, that was just right after 9/11. I don't know, they may have started building fusion centers in 2001, 2002. I'm not quite sure. But in the 20 or so years that they've existed, according to articles from all over the United States, they haven't discovered one single terrorist plan or plot, and they certainly haven't thwarted any. So what the heck are they doing? All right. And Congress has asked them, what are you doing with all this money? Plus now they're up to 79 or 80 fusion centers. So it's more than one per state. And I said, oh my God, we're going to have a fusion center on every corner, and you may have to walk by and get frisked, every street corner. So, what happened after NSA fired me, and I think it happened just before as well, but I hadn't tracked it down as well, was that I started getting stalked and harassed, not by NSA security, which I identified pretty clearly were stalking and harassing me because of the whistleblowing. But I started being stalked and harassed by absolute total civilians. And I did my own investigation. I had gone down to Florida. I was in Maryland to work for NSA. And then as I waited for the EEOC lawsuit to be heard, and that takes years, I went down to Florida to see if I could help my elderly parents because they're in their late 80s and needed some help, So I stayed there, ended up staying there a couple of years because my mother fell twice and needed rehab. So it was a very long process to get her back on her feet. And at that point in time, my lawyer also had subpoenaed, had asked for the right to subpoena the identity of a certain NSA manager who I had actually caught in 2006 leaving my house after trying to report what turned out to be, or what it looked like to be, a Mossad honeypot blackmail operation. Okay, so I get fired for trying to report that and have it investigated. And this upper NSA manager, SES is pretty high. It's like a flag badger. It's GS-15. So it's very high. So this is the man that was leaving my house. It was broken into. And that was a Saturday. And 2 days later, I see him outside my office at NSA, and he's messing around in the server room. So I go into my office, and my computer's the only one down, and it's down all day. As long as the guy's in the server closet, it's down. So I went past him several times and kind of memorized his face because I draw. And so I took notes and did an outline, did a caricature of him for later. And I started to show that picture to say, who is this man? And people got real nervous. And I even noticed that people sometimes, if they saw me coming, would do this and go, hi, good morning. How are you? Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So I knew I was onto something. But I mean, NSA basically wanted me to shut up about it. And I had in the process lost a double promotion and work credit to the honeypot because they wanted to elevate her to a higher echelon so she could blackmail people who were higher up. So that's why I ended up filing a lawsuit and why they ended up firing me. But like I said, I had gone down to Florida, and we had asked the judge to subpoena the identity of this man that I ended up figuring out who he was, and we wanted to verify it. And that got ignored. But as soon as we did that, I started being stalked and harassed in Florida. Well, that's 700 plus miles away from Maryland. I'm like, who are these people? Because they seemed like civilian numbnuts, And so I noticed that they were doing the type of stalking harassment that NSA had exactly. I mean, patterns and practices, absolutely by the book, same type of thing. And so I also noticed that certain people in my parents' neighborhood suddenly were getting new roofs, new carpets, all kinds of things that you really don't. I mean, every so often you see somebody in the neighborhood get something like that. It's no big deal. But when you have 5 or 6 at once, all getting it, something's going on. So I also noticed that there were like a couple people who went door to door and would get invited in and stay for a while and then go to yet another house. And I said, well, that's kind of strange. They weren't in uniform, like they weren't in police uniform or anything. And after this stalking harassment I think that went on from spring of 2015 to late 2015, only stalking harassment. And I will have to back up a little bit and say that just before the stalking harassment started, I was followed around by what appeared to be two teams not at once, they varied. One guy would drive a car, park at the lake where I usually walk my dogs, and another guy would get out of the car and follow me around and take pictures of me. Oh, come on, And so I said, all right, this is suspicious, and I bet it has to do with NSA. And on one occasion, I turned the tables on him and got his picture and the picture of one of the cars with the license. And it seemed to basically lead back to the Naval Security Group in Pensacola. And the Naval Security Group actually has its headquarters on Fort Meade, Maryland, co-located with the National Security Agency.
Right.
Very interesting. So that started the entire stalking by maybe contractors, maybe Navy, but mostly civilians. Okay. And another interesting thing was the night before the stalking, just was ready to go. I would have 2 or 3 people sitting on the road outside the house, ready to follow me anywhere I went. And so just the night before that happened, there was a recording that was on obviously huge speakers that blew out all across the lake where my parents lived. And you could hear it for miles. And it was just a recording of a barrage of big guns,
Right.
that would use battlefield, and boom, 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 boom. And I went to the lake and I looked, I said, there's no fireworks. And it does sound like a recording. So I ended up talking to a Leon County Sheriff's Department deputy. And I said, what was that? Because it was tied to nothing. No 4th of July, no anything. And he said, I used to be in the military, and we would do that to start a broad scale exercise. I said, oh, really? Okay. And then he went on to brag to me. He said, in fact, we have an exercise going on now in town. The National Security Agency flew down here, and they flew on cargo planes and had their own Jeep. So they went to the Laura Phipps property just on Lake Jackson. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, that's like spitting distance from my parents. NSA is there. Oh, yeah. And they're doing this big exercise with the FBI and with the Naval Security Group. And with the Leon County Sheriff's Department and other, like state police and that type of thing. Said, okay, that's very interesting. Didn't tell him anything. And name for future reference. And so it seems like what happened was the NSA went to the Fusion Center and said, oh, we have this terrible problem. This woman is a dangerous terrorist. You're going to need to stalk and harass her and keep an eye on her. Right. So, you cannot work for the National Security Agency and have ties to Russia or ties to Iran or, I just do a little drug dealing on the side. You can't do that.
Right.
Either their background investigation is good or it's crap. Really. And plus, I had taken reinvestigation psych evals every 5 years or so. That's
right.
Required. And I'd totally passed them every single time. So am I crazy? That would be interesting to have gone from totally sane to crazy in 2.5 seconds or something like that. So I noticed that and I said, okay, I'm starting to put this together. And fusion centers were involved in the exercise. And I ended up watching some of these people go house to house. And by the end of 2015, they were getting frustrated because I wasn't dropping my lawsuit. And I also wasn't being intimidated by hicktards following me around,
Right.
So I ended up saying, okay, at a certain point, I'd call the FBI and they're like, we're not going to talk to you. So, well, that's not suspicious.
Wow.
Yeah. And I said, well, I can come down and see you in your office. No, you're not allowed in. Oh, really? Okay. Interesting. And I called the FBI in Washington and told them who I was and that there was something suspicious going on. And they said, "Goodbye, Miss Stewart," and hung up on me after identifying me. I said, "Okay, all right." So, like I said, I kept an eye on what was going on, who was involved, what neighbors were involved. The neighbors were also stalking, harassing. But what became very interesting was at the end of November in 2015, we all of a sudden started getting hit with directed energy weapons. Now, I knew about the existence of large directed energy weapons, like on a battleship, Humvee,
LRADs.
huge, like for Iraq.
Mhm.
And I knew we had illegally used them there. We had fried people with the microwave, which
New
is
York.
absolutely, totally against Geneva Convention.
New York
Okay.
as well. They use those on riot vehicles in New York City.
I'm sorry, but you cannot give this type of weapon to a policeman. Oh, give me a break, you know? But anyway, I knew they had done that and it was shameful. But then we started, I'm sitting in this house in a Florida neighborhood with 2 elderly parents, and together we had 4 dogs. And I had 1 cat. The third night of the attacks, the cat was fried. Okay, that's how bad they were. We ended up calling a master electrician. I knew it was coming from outside the house, but we wanted to verify that nothing terrible was going on inside the house. He came out and said, "I don't know what the hell is going on, but it's from outside the house. There's not anything wrong with any of your interior wiring, but you had damage to the refrigerator, damage to the microwave oven, damage to the dishwasher, a fried router, a fried iPhone." You know, he said, I can't explain it. I can verify, but I can't explain it. And so I'm thinking, yeah, it's a directed energy weapon, you know, anti-personnel. So, like I said, I had kept an eye on a couple of people going house to house, and they would stay sometimes for hours or for days at the individual houses. And I noticed the first few attacks were only nocturnal. They started in midnight and then ended up turning off at dawn. And I started to go out and watch to see what was going on in the woods around the neighborhood. And by golly, somebody was getting let off into the woods with some kind of attaché case. They would run into the woods. These are nasty woods. You don't want to go in those woods. And then the car would drive, and the emanations would start, and they wouldn't stop until dawn or just before dawn. Then another car would come by. Somebody would run out from the woods with an attaché case, jump in the car, and they'd be gone. Well, they were doing that for a while, and then they started sending people around house to house, and then these people apparently were paid to host them so they could attack us from line of sight houses, you know, the schedule. And the pattern and practice is that once they got inside people's homes, then they started hitting us with these directed energy weapons on a schedule, like from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then they would up at 20%, and then 10 a.m. to 2 o'clock, and then they would up at 20%. And then by the time you got to midnight or so, it was hellacious. It was absolutely horrible inside the house. I ended up moving to the other side of the house so my parents wouldn't get burned on their faces anymore, because, you know, you could get actual, looks like a sunburn, but it wasn't. So I ended up going to the laundry room and trying to sleep there and shield, and then trying to figure out what the heck is going on, you know. And I ended up tracing the 2 people who were going house to house. And for a while, they were living in somebody's RV and using the RV engine to hit us with the directed energy weapon. Okay. So I said, all right, I'm going to go to, I tried so hard to educate and get help from the Leon County Sheriff's Department, because that was their jurisdiction, even though I had zero confidence in them. But I ended up going to the Fusion Center and saying I'd like to talk to somebody in the domestic terrorism unit. And who did they send out?
NSA, probably.
Well, no, the 2 people going all over the neighborhood, staying with neighbors. What they were doing, bringing them directed energy weapons, teaching them how to use it, telling them what schedule to use it on, and then moving on to another house.
You know what I find really interesting? I didn't mean to cut you off, but what I find really interesting is when we talk about energy weapons, and we talk about LRADs, and we talk about anti-personnel high-frequency weapons. First of all, the government denied it for a very long time that those even existed. And then they denied the fact that they even used them and knew what they were. Like, they thought that this whole directed energy thing, it's a conspiracy. But what's funny is when Cuba started using it against Americans in the embassy, all of a sudden, directed energy weapons are real, and Havana syndrome is real, because it was a communist state focusing those LRADs, or those high frequency weapons, at U.S. personnel. And what I find really intriguing is you mentioned Corey Station, you mentioned Pensacola and Naval Security Group. I was actually on that base. I went to Corey Station for my signal intelligence schooling, and the NSG is really huge there on that base. Like, when you first go into the gate, the NSG's there. You can't miss it. Huge golf balls, and it's just a really active place. And then you talk about fusion centers, and I've had my own experience with fusion centers. There's one in Pasadena, Texas, right outside, right on the edge of Houston. And the FBI and the sheriff's office and other other ICs are involved in that fusion center. So I can completely verify that activity, because I've dealt with the FBI in Houston as part of the fusion center. And they approached me through the sheriff's department. And then all of a sudden, the FBI got involved. And what I find really interesting, you're talking about the door-to-door, and it reminds me of when I did my SF-86, and I was going for my top secret security clearance. And I had to list all my neighbors and all my contacts and addresses. But, they never go to the addresses that you list. They always go a door down or the door the other way, and really dig into people. And, like you mentioned, is street clothed people. OPM never wears, any kind of badge. I mean, it's just, those people are the ones that you face on that level. And something that really struck me was when you were talking about the psyche valves every 5 or so years. When I took my counterintelligence polygraph for the NSA, when I was working in SIGINT, that was a very intrusive polygraph. I mean, everybody gets them that's working in the intelligence community. And during that polygraph, they try to connect you with, outside foreign entities. They try to assess if you've, compromised a government machine or server. Very specific questions. And you would think once you pass that polygraph that they wouldn't doubt those things, right? But I've seen so many people who have had that level of clearance that I've had, and I'm sure that you've had, that ended up getting doubted, and even military members that leave the military with high clearances that get put on watch lists. And I think it's just shocking.
It is. And I have to wonder, because nobody's sane is going to put somebody who's had that type of experience on a watch list unless they're afraid of what the person knows that's bad about the entity where they were working, or someone specific there. Like I said, I can name the people who are behind the honeypot operation. And one of them I could prove had family ties to the Israeli military. Could he possibly be open to being a Mossad operative? So, I mean, they went all out to protect themselves. And I was absolutely shocked at how many upper level managers wanted to squash this and didn't care. I mean, I had testimony that, oh yeah, she's sleeping her way through the management in the Weapons and Space Directorate where I was working. And I got absolute total confirmation about that. And that's by itself, according to the NSA rules, if you have compromised another person you're working with, let's say there's one married and one has an affair, then the way that they're supposed to deal with it is you call both people in and say, no, you can't do this. One, you can choose be fired right now, or you can call in whatever spouse is involved and tell her or him, I was having an affair. Then you can't be blackmailed. Okay. But you don't do it as Rick, and that's what was going on. So, like I said, awfully suspicious. And it looks very much like they were indeed compromised and were more or less working for Mossad. I mean, what the heck, And I knew Russell Tice and he reported something that indicated that the Chinese had infiltrated, and he got fired. Really? You know, I mean, you report something that you think is very important, and then you get persecuted. But anyway, go ahead.
It kind of reminds me of 2016 when I was doing some work with the agency, and they wanted me to focus on a foreign entity that could or couldn't be manipulating certain things in the US. And when I finally realized that it wasn't that entity, that it looked like it was internal to the agency, then all of a sudden they went ghost. And I leave the country and I get my passport revoked. And it just came out on the news just recently that Hillary Clinton had somebody get into Donald Trump's servers and plant evidence of connections with Russia. And I'm sure that probably stems back to, I don't know, maybe 2016. So, you know, there's a lot of things that people, and I want to really focus on this for a second. There's a lot of things that people, you know, consider conspiracy, right? And when we talk about conspiracy, it's something completely different. We look at government cover-up. We look at, you know, misuse and abuse of power, stuff that's legitimate conspiracy on their side. But I think what's really interesting is they plant people in the public media and different media agencies and these wingnuts who are like out of their mind and spouting conspiracy theory. So once they plant those people and they get that mindset of, okay, these guys are talking about this topic, it can't be true because these guys are just out of their minds. Alex Jones being one of them. And so when you or I say, okay, there's something going on here, and I think somebody needs to look into it, all of a sudden we get grouped with the likes of Alex Jones and conspiracy theories. But what's funny is, you know, as time passes by and, you know, things kind of settle down, then all of a sudden information and data comes to the surface that, hey, wait a minute, maybe that wasn't really a conspiracy theory. I mean, a perfect example was Cuba and the directed energy weapons there. And for the longest time, people were like, oh, that's conspiracy. Cuba was saying, oh, it's conspiracy. But what was funny was the U.S. actually acknowledged that they were had an effect from those energy weapons on government employees. And that to me was shocking because they're willing to admit that, but they still say, oh, the use of high energy weapons against U.S. citizens, that's conspiracy theory. Well, you know, come on, let's look at Cuba and let's look at what we did with anti-personnel in Iraq and the big dishes on the SUVs and the Humvees in New York for riot control. Same thing. And for those of you who don't know what high energy directed energy weapons are, when I speak about LRAD, it's such a high frequency that when that dish is pumped up and the amps go up, and that energy and that RF go out, it literally will disable somebody. They will bend over and start puking. I mean, it's a debilitator. And for the longest time, we denied the use of those until it came out in Iraq that we were actually using those against riot control. So yeah, there's a lot of theories floating around. People don't know how the DIA work. They don't know how NSA works. And there's a reason why they keep those agencies secret, because they don't always follow the rules. I just talked to Kurt Swiestak, who is former FBI, and he is now a big supporter for whistleblowers in the FBI and represents them as a lawyer because of what happened to him. And so that level of corruption exists every day. And people and U.S. citizens are led to believe that it's not really true. That's conspiracy. Take Wormwood, for example. Everybody thought that was a conspiracy. Oh, the CIA would never give people or targets LSD. Come to find out, it's truth. So, the things you're telling me, I can completely relate to because I've been down that road. I've seen how ICs work. I know what we have to do to get into the IC, and I know what goes on. And it's a complete shame that people deal with that, especially someone who's trying to support the government for 28 years and retired. It's an absolute shame. And I don't know at what point we're going to look back and say, you know what, this was the demise of the US government. And this is why we fell as an empire, because we could not maintain a level of checks and balances. and people and government agencies ran awry. I mean, do you think that's where we're headed as a nation? Do you think that that's going to be our demise?
I think everything is infiltrated. Everything. I mean, I've heard people talk about one specific gentleman saying, well, you know that drug cartels send people to infiltrate Department of Homeland Security. I'm like, oh, God, I guess so. And then other people are talking about the Chinese and Iranian people who have infiltrated our government. And what you look at in the headlines is people selling us out right and left. Yes, we are headed for destruction, from our leadership that is selling us out and saying, well, I'll be okay. I just have to, sell out these other bozos. But I will give you one alternate theory on the attacks on the diplomats in China and Cuba. I sat there thinking, okay, Nikola Tesla started to invent this type of thing in the early, if not late 1800s. He died in the early 20th century. The FBI got a hold of all of his notes.
Destroyed him.
And these weapons have been developed being developed for 60 years, and they didn't know about them, and they thought maybe they were crickets. I don't think so. Sonic crickets in Cuba. That's a heck of a weapon, I'll tell you. But I sat there thinking, this happened after Trump got in. Trump probably was going to normalize and better relations with Cuba. He was going to normalize or at least try to better relations with China. And if you're CIA and you're using these two places to run drugs or human trafficking or things outside the U.S. realm of watching you, you don't want anything normalized. So why don't you take the weapons and turn it on your own people so that you can screw up relations with these two countries at least? That's a theory. I don't personally believe that the Cubans turned it on our people. And I don't personally believe the Chinese turned it on our people. I think it was CIA, but I can't prove it. That's my opinion,
I can tell you that the CIA does have interest still in China. And I worked for a former CIA field manager, field officer. Last name is Susong. And he was based in Northern Africa and Morocco. And when I was working for him, one of the first offices this Dallas-based intelligence company opened was in Beijing. And they knew the chief of police in Beijing, went and met with him and set ground and opened up an office in Beijing. This intelligence company was built and developed and ended up being sold off to a cybersecurity company. They had boots on the ground in I don't know how many foreign countries. And I was working there and kind of leading the malware reversal lab and kind of vulnerability research. And we had an individual that we pulled out of prison and made him sort of an asset and put him in a foreign country. And this is where things got a little weird for me when it came to working for intelligence companies. I was kind of a handler for this guy, and he was conversing back and forth, and he started to worry if we were a 3-letter agency. Why would we need this information? Why can't you talk to me about this? Who do you work for? What 3-letter agency are you? And as soon as I reported this information, the intelligence company cut ties with him and left him in that country, the country where he was wanted by organized criminals. And I went home and I had a conversation with a good friend of mine on the East Coast through my internet connection that I paid for, through my computer that had nothing to do with the company. And the next morning, when I went into the office, they had the dialogue between me and my friend on the East Coast. And at that point, I knew what was going on. And I had to go through the same issue. I had people that were following me. I had to file a cease and desist through a lawyer in Dallas for them to stop surveillance. They were showing up at different places that I would work, wanting demos and just kind of like showing their face like, hey, we're still here type thing. It was more of an intimidation tactic. And it was really frustrating. But eventually, that kind of died down. But I didn't stop talking about it because I wanted people to know that, when you deal with people like the CIA and specific individuals, and it's not everybody in the CIA that's that way, but when you deal with somebody who's corrupt and has a defunct mind, they're going to do manipulative things and harass you and do things that they know is powerful, right? But then you have people who walk the line and who really want to help the country. I have a friend of mine who's former CIA, and he worked in the technology office, and he's just a great guy, and follows the rules and is there to help me whenever I need help as far as technology goes and trying to make my ideas, fruitful. Great guy. But I have to say that he's rare. Most of the people I've ran into in the different agencies, if you're not part of their club or if you don't follow the company line, you end up being put on a list and kind of treated differently. And it ends up becoming harassment. And, we've seen it, corruption within the government, being infiltrated, Robert Hansen, who leaked secrets to the Russians, these are paramount cases that set a precedence. And it happens every day. And that's what people don't understand is our government is full of plants and information that we find secretive to protect not only servicemen, but civilians alike is being leaked to the wrong hands. And I don't know what it's going to take to fix that. I mean, you look at Snowden, right? Snowden got ousted from the country, put on a list. They wanted to kill this guy because he leaked information from XKeyscore. So we all knew what was going on with XKeyscore way before he leaked it. We knew that the NSA was watching people and tapping phone calls. It was no huge surprise. But what really shocked me was even after he was out of the country in Russia and the appeals court identified XKeyscore as illegal process and against the Constitution, they didn't pardon him. He's still in Russia. He can't come home. But this is a government operation that has been deemed illegal, but yet he's still treated like a criminal. I mean, who's the real criminal in this situation, right?
I agree. And I've said he can't come home. I don't care if they pardon him or not, because NSA will kill him with directed energy weapons. They'll just murder.
Or the DIA. The DIA is very, very good at covert operations and clandestine operations. And a lot of people don't understand, too, is that the FBI and the CIA are not the only agencies that do clandestine operations. You have the DIA, you have naval intelligence. You have a lot of people who practice these clandestine operations, not just against foreigners, but against their own assets that have gone rogue or what they consider rogue.
Or people who have the goods on them that they have turned, this directorate or something is basically a crime gang. When you have all the different clearances and the people next door, you don't know what they do. You assume that maybe they are analyzing Russian submarines, but no, they're running damn drugs, and they're just saying, oh, okay, we're top secret, Millhouse or something. No, you're not. You're a drug runner, and you're doing it under cover of your job. So it becomes very difficult because you have people out there on the line doing a real job, and then you have scumbags hiding behind us and then ruining our lives if we trip upon something and say, well, what is this?
Yeah, I mean, let's look at that movie, American Made, with Tom Cruise and how the government helped him set up his operation. But what happened to him when he went rogue? I mean, they tracked him down. Even though he was still doing the things they had set him up to do, they went after him. And there's so many cases of that where take my lawyer, for instance, that helped me with my cybercrime issue. There was a CIA asset that was running explosives to Libya and got put in prison. And in front of the court, he said, I work for the CIA. This was authorized. And the CIA said, we have no idea who this guy is. They sent him to prison for over 20 years. My lawyer, who was CIA, retired CIA, and still had a clearance to get into Langley, went and pulled all the documentation from that operation and proved that he was an asset and got him out of prison. I think he lived for maybe a couple of years later and passed away. But here's a guy that spent many years in prison because the government screwed him over. Because he was an asset, he didn't have the direct connection. He wasn't part of the good old boy network. So as soon as he got caught, oh, hey, we don't know him. And they obviously did. And that happens every day.
Yeah. No, I believe it. Absolutely believe it. I mean, they will stab anybody in the back. I mean, with the directed energy weapons, I have gotten a lot of health issues. I mean, like I told you, when I went down to visit my parents, they're in their late 80s. They're in their mid to early 90s now. I have damn good genes. By accident, I have damn good genes. But I went my entire life with no problems. I mean, every so often a headache, But when they started hitting me with directed energy weapons, oh my gosh, scarred retinas. How do you get scarred retinas? Bleeding in the brain, blood clots flowing down my throat, desiccated heart, all kinds of stuff that, boom, just kind of happened with the exposure to these weapons. And I mean, it's a slow kill. It's basically what they're doing is they're slow killing you. I mean, I don't have any idea that I'm going to live into my 90s. I mean, 65 now. I don't know if that I'm going to live into my 70s, because these things are horrid. And they're hitting me right now for the past several months with radio frequency. Well, radio frequency, like I said, will desiccate your heart and it will give you COVID. I mean, not COVID, COPD. So guess what my last two pets died from? Destroyed lungs, destroyed heart.
Wow.
Radio frequency. Okay. And I'm getting the same. So they pay nitwit neighbors telling them, and I've heard twice now, oh, she's a pedophile. Really? Really? Because they don't have anything on me because I haven't done anything wrong. And I tell people, I said, it's worse the better a person you are, the more depraved their accusations get. I mean, they seem to be going to neighbors saying, well, she did this or she did that. We can't possibly use the law to arrest her. Why? But you have to kill her for us. Why? And people, it doesn't occur to them that maybe that's unconstitutional, that's unfair, that's unjust, that if I had done something actually wrong, why would I not be arrested and charges pressed against me and go to prison? Why would you kill someone in their house? And I'm stupefied by the level of non-intelligence in the average American,
Yeah. Well, and here's one thing I want people to think about, right? So for the longest time, we knew that the CIA was carrying out assassinations on different people. And they were falling ill from these weird effects. Let's take the heart attack, for instance, right? There was some people that were assassinated and all they could find was, it was natural causes. They died of heart failure. People, completely healthy people died of heart failure. And what did we find out years later? That there was a heart attack gun that the CIA had developed and admitted to. And it literally sent people into coronary failure. You have things like that. Of course, I spoke about wormwood and how that was used against the scientists that helped them develop that technique. He ended up throwing himself out of a hotel window, and later on finding that he wasn't thrown and that the CIA was actually involved. I mean, there's a lot of that goes on, and I don't mind when people say, "Oh, that's you're wearing a tinfoil hat," because then I break it down and I put the data in front of them. Say, let's talk about the heart attack gun. That's an admitted weapon the CIA used at that time. Let's look at wormwood. Let's look at historical precedents that shows the covert and clandestine weapons that they used against civilians. It's legit. I mean, especially with wormwood, I speak a lot about that because CIA used to test that on people that they would meet in bars, not in Russia, not in China, but in the US,
American is expendable.
Yeah. And that's the way they look at it. And, working in intelligence for many years, it's like, I know what we're capable of as far as good goes. And I know what we're capable of as far as bad and corruption goes, because I've seen both sides of it. And it leaks into business because those agents or those operatives, when they leave those services, they go into the public service and they go into commercial entities. They go in big corporations, and that same level of corruption follows them. And those companies become assets to the agencies. And it's really disgusting, I think, because a lot of the CIA agents that I've known in the past have worked at major corporations and technology firms as CIA operatives, as a cover. That was their cover, was working as a technologist. and the stuff that I've seen. But, and you talk about assassinations and tinfoil hats and stuff, let's talk about Bill and Hillary Clinton, with the Arkansas Mafia and people committing suicide all around them. There's just so many things that people don't really sit down and think about and really dig into and try to find real data. And it's just a shame. A lot of people will blow it off as conspiracy, but it's real. It's real and it's here.
Well, the bad thing is that, they treat their own people like this, and then they go out and do random things to innocent people. But what really horrified me when I got into investigating the Fusion Center was I started giving interviews and doing, every so often somebody would write some kind of article or something, and I would put my contact info, And I started getting calls and emails from hundreds of people who were civilians who had been targeted by the fusion centers, and they had gone around telling these people's neighbors that they were spies, they were pedophiles, they were wife beaters, they were drug dealers. And I'm like, why would you do that? And it looks to me like to keep their budget, they had to come up with millions of terrorists inside the United States, and we had hoovered in so many Muslims. 9/11. I mean, I in my mind, I just really see kind of people walking down the streets of Cairo and having our people come Shanghai them and you're going to be an immigrant, and throw them into the United States because they wanted a pool of people. They could say, well, we have to watch these people because they're Muslims. Well, the Muslims were happy as can be to be here and be free and do what they want. And there weren't any terrorists. So, okay, well, we're going to have Tawanda Jones and Larry Smith, and we're going to put them on the watch list. And then we're just going to get all these other people. And what I found out from one story was the IRS had set their sights on a man who had a drywall company. It was a very good company. It was doing very well. And they wanted to rip him off. And so they went to the Fusion Center and said, okay, we need Joe Brown. We want to get this kind of money from him, but he hasn't done anything wrong. But we need you to fabricate a dossier that we can give to the FBI. The FBI can take it in front of the FISA court and say, looks like he's, mingling with, Mexican Martians or something. And so they made up this dossier, and the Fusion Center ran with it, trying to say, we find you that you're suspicious, and we may want to, do away with your business. And the IRS is why, well, if you just pay this fine, I'm sure we can smooth it out. And they counted on intimidating the guy and forcing him to pay money he didn't owe them, but he got a lawyer instead. And I think that was Bernhardt in Texas. And in discovery, they found out about the false dossier. And I said, they're making false dossiers against 2-3 million people inside the United States to take to the idiot FISA court and have them issue surveillance warrants. And then the surveillance equipment is, guess what? Directed energy weapons. They're not watching you, they're cooking you, and it's all for their budget. And I've before I said, this is where, taking the mother who says, I don't want my child taught this in school, and mixing her with terrorists. And all of a sudden you've got what the DHS is really going for, is to make every single person in the United States not on their payroll a terrorist.
That goes back to I equate all of this back to the originating law that was passed, the originating act that was passed by Congress and by the executive branch. And that would have been the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act gave people power to turn their neighbors into terrorists. I know from experience, I lived close to the Fusion Center in Houston, and I talked about how they approached me about a Pakistani family who lived across the street. And it wasn't about being a terrorist. It wasn't about potential connections to terrorists or terrorist ties. It was about the fact that they had expensive cars in the driveway and they had a large number of them. Well, they were selling them. There may have been some covertness on the Pakistani part, but really, what did they have to go by besides what, trying to quiz me what I saw going on? And again, they were Muslim. And I lived, not even 5 miles from one of the biggest mosques in Texas. And, they didn't mess with them. They came knocking on my door. You know, they don't want them because it's hard to prove a case against them. But it's a lot easier to look at the tax returns and whatnot of an American citizen and say, oh, well, you know, I need to put you on the OFAC list, which was what I was on at one point, because I was potentially connected to a terrorist organization, which I later found out was a hacktivist group, which I thought was really funny. So you're going to classify me as a terrorist and you're putting me on the OFAC list, even though I'm domestic and we don't have any terrorist ties. But they stretch that rule because it's a rule that they can manipulate. It's a rule that they can control. And when you look at corruption, you know, let's take FBI corruption for a second. You know, when you look at the history of corruption with the FBI, I mean, it goes all the way back to the founder of the FBI, Hoover himself. You know, they had blackmail against him because they knew he was a cross-dresser. You know, he was vulnerable in that situation. So that corruption has been there from the beginning of these entities. It's bred in that corruption. And I just, you know, I don't think that we're on a good track, you know, especially when I look at what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And the US government and Biden is making threats, and they're saying that, you know, we're here to protect the Ukrainians. This is a humanitarian effort. It's not a humanitarian effort. It's a fight over natural gas pipeline. Just like it was in Iraq. It wasn't trying to free Iraqi people. It was trying to get a percentage of the oil pipeline into war reparations. And, you know, when I talk about war reparations, people's eyes get glazed over. And I'm like, yeah, people pay us for what we do during war. That's their way of giving it back. And most of the time, we're after natural resources. You know, you wonder why we go into a specific country and fight a war. It's not about freedom. It's not about democracy. Those people care less about democracy. It's about that pipeline or that natural resources underground. That's what we're after. So, I mean, that corruption, I think, is going to continue on. I don't see any end in sight. And I think that China and Russia is that balancing act, right? I think that they're to the point where they've had enough. And I think American citizens, once they really open their eyes, if they can, I think they're going to see what's going on and the game is played. And just like every empire that, you know, the cycle runs about 254 years. We're real close to that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. I mean, I've rethought Russia. I saw Putin in an interview, and he was saying, we don't want to develop electromagnetic weapons, but the United States keeps going with this weaponry. We think nuclear is just as good a deterrent as you can get. We don't need to keep going with electromagnetic weapons that really you don't have a deterrent, because you can use that weapon against whatever city, kill everything in it, including the roaches that would have survived a nuclear attack, and just replace it with your own people. You haven't damaged any kind of infrastructure. You just kind of raided. I mean, you know, like the bug spray raid. You've just kind of sprayed it, killed the people, and you go in and take over the city and the resources. So Russia had said, knock it off with the electromagnetic weapons research. We don't want to be in this weapons race, you know. Now, China is entirely different, because China has poisoned themselves to the point that they're eating heavy metals. And they want to extinguish other people and just move into their land. I think Russia is pretty fine. Like, you know, why don't you guys leave us alone?
Yeah. You
know, we're happy. Leave us alone. You know, but China to me is a different story. They're very highly predatory. They're not. I think they feel like they can't correct their country. They have the least amount of potable water, and it is polluted beyond imagination. We have the most amount, counting Canada especially, we have the most amount of potable water, and we have vast ranges of, basically farmland and ranges for cattle and all that kind of stuff. And China says, we want that country. You know, so totally different aspects to these countries, what they want and what they don't want. But I am concerned that the Chinese will keep coming, and that they have a friend in one certain party, much more so than we even want to admit. And the other party is kind of dull-witted, and they don't see anything. What's the problem? You know, so that doesn't help us at all. You know, so we do have a problem from what we've put into power. And unfortunately, a lot of the time they say, your government reflects your society. Oh, that's bad.
It's frightening. It's really frightening. But I always say that 90% of U.S. citizens or Americans, as long as they get their Starbucks every morning and can go shop at Target, they could give a shit less what goes on. And they turn on the TV to Fox News or CNN and get spoon-fed what the news media and what the government wants them to believe. Even though, working in intelligence, you and I both know, when we go into another country during conflict, what we see on Fox News is completely different than what we're seeing on the ground. And that's been a campaign and propaganda machine forever. I mean, I just watched Dr. Zhivago last night, 3-hour movie about the Russian Revolution and the Civil War, and the way that the U.S., I guess, media or movie machine has used that as propaganda against Russia. I mean, the book was even banned in Russia when the book was written because of the way that they portrayed the Russians. So this has been a silent battle for a very long time. But Karen, I really appreciate you being on the show. I hope people take some of this and really start to think about it. Even if they don't believe it 100%, just think about it. Just start a discussion. And, I hope that eventually, this harassment will stop for you. It's one of those things where I know firsthand how stressful it can be when you can't get a bank account, when you can't own a house. It's hard, and you feel like less of a citizen. And they do that, and I call the process making you a ghost. And they're very effective at that. But I appreciate it, and this will be going up on the internet. And I don't care how many people it shocks, because I think people need to know your story and need to know the real data and the science behind what's going on.
Well, they need to know the Fusion Center could be coming after them next for no damn reason.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
They need to get interested in having all this entire program shut down.
Yep, I agree. Well, thank you for coming on, and I'd like to have you on again real soon and catch up on what we're doing. And thank you for supporting the podcast. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. And good luck to you, and I wish you the best.
Lovely to have met you and spoken with you. You take care.
You too.
All right, we're back. Next up, we've got the Something Old segment. This is from the recent Predict 2022 event. This is a presentation by Martin Mao, who is the co-founder and CEO of Chronosphere. Martin's presentation is called Observability Predictions for 2022. We seem to have a lot of observability on this show today. So he looks at, he shares his predictions about open standards adoption, centralization of observability practices, and data growth. And 2022 is the year for observability, it seems like, and his presentation definitely backs up that idea. So let's go ahead and roll it now.
Hey everyone, it's Martin here to talk to you today about observability predictions for 2022. Before we get started, just a little bit about myself and my background. Historically, have worked at bigger tech companies like Microsoft and Amazon in the cloud infrastructure space. So at AWS, I was a tech lead on the EC2 team and really transitioned over to the observability space when I joined Uber, where I led the core observability team. And our mission there was to really help Uber transition from their traditional monolithic application on VMs to a microservices architecture on containers, which perhaps today is known as cloud native architecture. And as we were helping Uber through that, we realized that a lot of their existing monitoring, logging, and observability solutions were not really, the ones that we were using for the old architecture weren't really well suited for this new cloud native architecture. So that was really the problem we solved for Uber, and we did that by building a lot of new tools. So things such as M3 for metrics and Jaeger for distributed tracing. And we're using those tools, and we open source those tools to really solve the observability problem at Uber. More recently, left Uber a few years ago to co-found a company called Chronosphere, where I'm currently the co-founder and CEO. And we are in the observability space. In fact, we provide a hosted SaaS observability solution. You can imagine helping companies like Uber transition over to cloud native architecture as well. And our product is built on top of a lot of the technologies that we had created while we were at Uber. But it's a little bit about my background and where a lot of the sort of domain comes from. You can imagine both being a practitioner before and now at Chronosphere, sort of helping a lot of companies with their observability challenges is where a lot of these predictions come from. So with that, I will go into the 3 predictions we have for 2022 in the observability space. And the 3 of them are that open standards reach critical mass. The second one is that centralized observability becomes the norm. And the last one is that data, and in particular observability data, that growth reaches a tipping point. So those are the 3 predictions we have for 2022. And we'll just dive into each one here, one after the other. Cool. So the first one we want to talk about is open standards reaching critical mass, and what does this mean? So a trend that we've been seeing recently in the past few years is that companies have been more and more moving away from a proprietary approach to observability. And what we mean by that is proprietary instrumentation, proprietary solutions. And there's a few reasons why a lot of companies want to move away from that more to a open source based or open standards based type of solution. The first one is that with a proprietary solution, there's actually a pretty high cost to switching. And the reason is that with a proprietary instrumentation, proprietary sort of tooling, you're fairly locked into that one piece of technology. So if you want to switch one out for another, there's actually a very heavy lift in both replacing all your instrumentation, replacing the tooling on the back end, and replacing all of the sort of knowledge base built from your end users on that tooling. So it's actually very expensive to switch between solutions, and that's a pain point that a lot of companies out there identify pretty quickly. More and more so, the other thing that's pushing the industry this way is that it's really easy to get started in open source these days now. So if you think about the modern cloud native architecture, and everything is built on top of Kubernetes, most of the things in that ecosystem are already come pre-instrumented, and they already come pre-instrumented in an open source standard. So if you think about metrics, everything is already pre-instrumented in a Prometheus format already, and it's one standard open source format. Or perhaps for distributed tracing, it's all instrumented in open telemetry. So there's a lot of I would say the community is just a lot more mature and integrated with these open source standards than ever before, and that didn't used to be the case. And not only that, the actual tooling itself, a lot of that is open source as well. So if you wanted to get going and start to monitor something, you could just run Prometheus as a single binary solution. You can get that up and running really quickly, and you have sort of out of the box monitoring there. Same for distributed tracing with a tool like Jaeger here. And not only are these tools speaking the open source standards, but they're also the sort of standard open source tools to get started with as well. So it's just a lot easier these days to get started with open source and have the ecosystem around that as well. And then the last one here that we hear from companies is that often when you have a proprietary tool, it's much harder to find new engineers, new developers to join your company, whether in the observability or SRE team or just general teams outside of that. We often find that most folks in the industry more and more so are skilled and trained up on the open source standards and the open source tooling versus a proprietary one. So if that is your stack, it's much higher chance to hire somebody who's already been familiar with that and they don't have to ramp up with it already. So these are some of the trends that we've been seeing in terms of why people are moving towards open source and away from sort of proprietary. And as I mentioned earlier, the sort of, and our sort of prediction this year is that it sort of reaches critical mass in the sense that it's past the point of almost no return here now. So, as I mentioned earlier, Prometheus is the standard metrics protocol and standard tool that companies use. And along with that tooling, PromQL is becoming the standard query language. Grafana dashboards are becoming the standard dashboarding, Prometheus Alert Manager, et cetera, right? So all of these are sort of becoming the industry standards here, and those protocols and how end users interact with them are also becoming standards. And same with OpenTelemetry on the distributed tracing side of things. And we see this sort of, you see on the bottom right here, this balance of power and at least data acquisition and data production is really swinging over to the more open path and a path where the customer or the company controls that data as opposed to a vendor, because it is in a format that is now universal. And you can imagine if you instrument your applications in these particular protocols, you can actually not lock yourself. You don't have to lock yourself into a particular vendor. You can actually switch between any of them that you want. And I think for this year in particular, what we're seeing is that more and more proprietary vendors are now seeing this trend and having to respond to it by also adding support for these open source protocols. So our sort of recommendation here for folks that may be in an observability team or an SRE team is that if you are going to pick a new project to instrument and how to sort of pick the protocols that you want to go with the open source standards, because those are the ones that protect you the most from vendor lock-in. That is the one where there's most community development and the industry is moving towards anyway. So that's sort of the safest choice there. And that still leaves you the flexibility with going with both open source, running it yourself, or vendors that support these open source protocols, or proprietary vendors as well. So that's sort of our recommendation that comes along with this particular trend that we see for this year. Cool. Switching gears a little bit, the second prediction here is that centralized observability becomes the norm. And what we mean by this is, if you think about perhaps historically, observability or monitoring, perhaps in larger organizations in particular, perhaps were siloed to their lines of business or to the business unit themselves. So what we often find is one particular business unit inside a larger company has their own set of tools and processes that's unique to just that business unit. And you can imagine that's different across all of the lines of business in that particular company. And there's some challenges with that type of approach. The first one is that often, even inside these lines of businesses, there's multiple tools. So it's not even a single tool. So you can imagine even inside one larger organization or one larger team, there's already multiple tools. You may have some tools for IT and monitoring to look at your network or your underlying infrastructure. You may have a different tool, like an APM tool for your applications. May have a different tool for perhaps the business data there. So it's already a sort of combination of different tools, and generally they don't work well together and they have different interfaces, because most of the time these are proprietary sort of tools with custom interfaces, custom query languages. So you can imagine, even as a developer inside of one of these teams, switching from tool to tool is already fairly difficult. You can imagine that's just for one line of business. So if you have multiple lines of business, each of them have different tools and different processes, which it just means that there is really no consistency across a company at all. And that brings up its own set of challenges. The second thing with that is that it's really hard to get a global view across everything. You can imagine with the different tools, that means the data is dispersed amongst different tools in different departments. And to get a more holistic view or overall view of a business is fairly difficult in this siloed approach of things. And finally, we find that each of these tools come with, and each of these lines of businesses have their own teams that that manage and run these tools. And often those teams are solving the same problems again and again and sort of reinventing the wheel. So there's a lot of perhaps waste there or inefficiencies there. So, we've historically seen a lot of organizations structured this way and think about sort of observability, or at least monitoring, APM, and infrastructure monitoring in this particular siloed approach. And what we think is going to happen moving forward, and we already see this in sort of newer organizations, is that observability becomes centralized instead. And generally, this is being driven by a central observability team, or perhaps a central SRE or DevOps team. And that team really they have a few main responsibilities, right? The first of which is defining the standards and best practices for observability, ideally across the whole company. And these standards and practices include things that we talked about earlier, includes things like the instrumentation libraries and the protocols, so things like using the Prometheus protocol and PromCure being the standard for metrics, or OpenTelemetry being the standard for distributed tracing. But it sort of goes beyond that even. So, you can imagine defining that is at least a start there across an organization. But you can imagine sort of defining things at a higher level there, and not just defining them. So, for example, things like what an SLO means or what an SLA means across an organization. SLOs are great tools to have, but if each team has a different meaning for it, or have a different way of measuring that, that seems to break down very quickly as you sort of go across teams and things like that. So sort of defining higher level things outside of just the instrumentation and the protocols are really part of those standards and best practices. And even taking that perhaps one step further, in the sense that not just defining and telling folks how to do it, sort of doing it on their behalf. So often we find that central teams can actually get into, let's say, the microservices scaffolding and start to produce automated instrumentation in terms of perhaps latency, error rates, and things like that, so that when a developer goes and creates a brand new application, they get that level of visibility for free out of the box. So all of that, we see as part of the responsibility of that central team, but also you get a lot of sort of benefits from having a central team do that across the whole company. That consistency across the whole company benefits hugely. So you can imagine if you're an engineer in one team in one line of business, and you're sort of trying to interact with or look at a dependent service that's owned by a different line of business, it is fantastic if you're able to query that data is in the one place, and you're able to query it, let's say, using the same query language, and everybody has the same definitions for what they mean by their SLA guarantees for their downstream services and whatnot. And all of that is consistent. It just makes everything so much easier. The second one here is that this central team generally, ideally, provides a single set of tools for observability, and this goes back into the having different tools with different interfaces is a bit of a disadvantage, especially because often what we find these days in modern cloud native architectures is that the issue isn't just in one part of the stack. It's actually a combination of multiple services running on different types of infrastructure, or different clusters, or perhaps infrastructure in different zones and things like that. So the view of the infrastructure and the application and the business, and having ideally that data in one single place, and having one set of tools on top of that, there are a huge amount of advantages around. The last two here is sort of the third one is supporting varying use cases. So you can see here we have an example of particularly different requirements from different teams, and sort of the one the other side of having a central system means that you need to be able to have that single system support all of these varying use cases. So perhaps, you can imagine some teams have very high cardinality use cases, some teams have different retention or scrape interval requirements or whatnot, and a lot of those have to be fulfilled by this central team. And then the last one here is sort of ensuring the reliability and the accessibility of this tooling. And again, this is on the other side of centralizing everything, is you need to make sure, now that there's a dependence on a single set of tooling, you need to really make sure that it is highly reliable, and especially when it comes to observability, because this is the system that is telling, is telling the rest of the company how the infrastructure is running, how the applications are running, how the business is running. So it's almost, this is mission critical. This is a mission critical piece of tech, or part of an infrastructure stack that needs to be almost the most reliable piece of that stack. And then accessibility is more the fact that now that all of these different end users in different teams and different lines of businesses are attempting to access this single tool set or single solution, ideally they get fair access, right? So you want to avoid things where perhaps one individual or one team accidentally creates a script and starts, accidentally putting too much load on the system. You want to make sure that that is limited just to that single team and doesn't really impact the availability of this overall observability solution to the rest of the teams and the organizations. And that's a big job of that central team. So what we see is that, again, coming back to the prediction here of sort of seeing this centralized model as opposed to a siloed model sort of become the norm for organizations moving forward, while specking out some of the responsibilities of what this central team will do. And sort of, our recommendation here are these things that this team will do, and then sort of, going beyond just providing the tooling, right? It's so much more than just providing the tooling. It's the standards and best practices that can really be rolled out across an organization, and having consistency there is hugely beneficial. So that is the second prediction. The third one here, switching gears again, is that data growth and observability data growth in particular reaches a tipping point. And what we mean by that is if we look at how the growth of the sheer volume of observability data is growing over the years, and not just over the years, as companies transition their architecture from perhaps on-premise to a VM-based cloud architecture to a cloud-native architecture, what we generally find is that the pace at which the observability data is growing is far faster and far outpacing the pace at which just the general business is growing, or perhaps the infrastructure footprint is growing. And if we want to take a specific smaller example of that, you can imagine perhaps a few years ago, folks will be running their applications on VMs, and now today on those exact same VMs, you're running a Kubernetes cluster. You're trying to go cloud native, right? And you've broken up that application into microservices instead, and you're running those on the containers on the same cluster. Now your infrastructure footprint and your bill for that cluster doesn't really change that much. The cloud providers don't charge you that much to run Kubernetes on top of the underlying VMs. You're really paying for the underlying VM. So your infrastructure footprint hasn't changed very much. With the same cluster size, you can imagine you're pretty much serving the same business use cases. So your business perhaps hasn't changed very much. Now with this new cloud native architecture, there's a bunch of advantages with it. Of course, you can imagine you can deploy multiple times a day, and that architecture is generally a lot more reliable. So there's a bunch of advantages with it. But one of the sort of unfortunate side effects of that architecture is that it produces a lot more data. And if you just think about why that may be, now you have a lot, tens of containers running on each VM. And if you think about monitoring a container, it's really the same amount of data that you would need to monitor a VM, because a container still emits its CPU usage, memory usage, disk usage, etc. Right? So it's the same amount of data each container requires as a VM. However, there's tens of these things running on top of every VM. And then on top of that, they're very ephemeral. So they're changing all the time. And every time they change, it's a brand new container. So you can just imagine the sheer amount of data that produces, again, on the same infrastructure footprint. It's so much more data there. Moving up the stack a little bit, same thing with your single monolithic application. And now it's broken up into tiny microservices. Each microservice emits, I wouldn't say the exact same, but the rough same order of magnitude of data as the original application. And now you have a lot more of those as well. So you can see very quickly how adopting this architecture results in so much more data being produced. And the downside of this is generally, as that data volume starts to grow, generally the cost of the observability system rises in a pretty correlated manner, because you can imagine either you're running these observability systems yourselves, in which case more data means more hardware to these systems, which increases the cost, or you use a managed vendor for your observability solution, and all of the vendor solutions out there also charge based on the volume of data in some way, because you can imagine underneath the covers, they also have to store all of that data, and that's sort of their cost model. So what we generally find is that cost rises are pretty correlated with the rise in observability data. And what that ends up meaning is that, the overall cost rises, but also the relative cost of observability to your infrastructure is so much higher now. So we often find when we talk to companies now is that maybe in the infrastructure bill, maybe observability is like number 2, number 3 on that list, and it's growing very quickly. And I'll say that if that was the case and companies were getting more value out of it, so if the observability data was growing and companies were getting far better visibility into everything, they were sort of reducing their time to repair or time to detection, I actually think companies would be fine with that because you get the value with the cost. But what we're seeing is that that's not the case. What we're seeing is that the data is growing at this pace and the cost is growing, yet people aren't getting better value. In fact, often when we ask people and companies, what is your mean time to detection or your mean time to repair? Those are often getting worse. So it's almost like you're paying a lot more for something and getting less return on that particular investment. And that sort of disparity is something that we believe is going to reach a tipping point in the sense that it's going to force companies to do something about that. So if you look at that problem a little bit, and I'll take a second to dive into each of these perhaps approaches to solve that data growth problem. But the overall approach here solving this problem is really to understand the outcomes. And by understand the outcomes is really by inspecting the data itself and understanding what you are using this data for and optimizing the data for those use cases instead. And more concretely, here are perhaps 4 techniques that can be used to go help with this data growth. So, I'll start with the 2 in the middle here, the retention period of the data and the resolution. So, a concrete example may be, I imagine most systems, whether you run it in-house yourself or use a managed vendor, there is one set retention period for all of your data. And generally, I believe that's set to about 13 months or so, which means every piece of data that gets produced, no matter how you want to use it, is retained for 13 months. Now, that may be useful for some pieces of data, but especially in the modern cloud-native architecture where we're deploying multiple times a day and a container is only around for a couple of hours, a huge amount of the modern observability data does not need to be retained for 13 months, especially not to the full level of detail. So, you can imagine instead, if you're tracking, let's say, the CPU of a particular pod, and you have that down to the unique pod ID level, there is no need to store that. In fact, it's quite a waste to store that data for 13 months. You may want to just store that data for a day, let's say, and then perhaps you do want to sort of store some amount of data over time for capacity planning, trend analysis, and whatnot, but it's never down to the per pod level. You're probably trying to store that across a cluster, across a particular set of services or something like that. You can imagine changing the retention period of that subset of data from a year, 365 days, down to a single day is going to have a 365x reduction in the amount of storage that you need, right? So retention is one way to go and optimize the data, but it's not just sort of setting the retention across all of your data. It's sort of understanding for each use case, for each subset of the data that serves those use cases, what is the optimal sort of retention period there. Very similar for resolution as well. You can imagine by resolution, we're really referring to what is the size of what is the frequency by which this data is being emitted. So am I tracking the CPU every 10 seconds versus every minute versus every hour? And depending on the use case, perhaps if you have a CI/CD type of use case, you're doing automated deploys, tracking it every second or 10 seconds makes a lot of sense because you need to know in real time very quickly what is happening with the CPU so that you can perhaps roll back a deploy or roll back a particular change. However, there are going to be other use cases out there where, again, maybe capacity planning or long-term trend analysis where actually you don't need that data down to the per second basis. And often what we find here, just like retention, is people just use the defaults, and the defaults are going to be somewhere between 10 seconds and a minute. And really understanding some of the sub use cases here and optimizing the data in terms of setting the resolution for that use case, again, helps a lot because you can imagine if we're measuring every 10 seconds versus we measure every minute, there is a 6x difference in the amount of data that needs to be produced and stored there. So, those two are two ways we can optimize the data based on the outcome and based on the use cases. The one on the right here, I'll cover, and then I'll come back to the first one. So the last one here is efficient storage. And by efficient storage, what we mean is a lesson we learned at Uber, is that a lot of this data for observability is time series data, which means it's a measurement of something over a period of time. Now, when you have that type of data, putting that type of data into just your general object store or key value store is hugely inefficient. Generally, you want to have a data store that's optimized for this type of use case. So, using relational databases or key value stores or blob stores are not the most efficient ways to store this data. And really, what you need is a storage solution that's built and purpose-built for this type of solution. So generally, those are time series databases. And actually out there, if you look at most of the open source solutions or the proprietary vendor solutions, most of them are actually not backed by time series storage technologies, which is interesting for sure. So there's definitely a lot of efficiencies there just in how we even store this data, because it's a particular type of data, a particular type of use case there. And then the last one that I'll touch upon here, this is perhaps the most effective one as well in dealing with data growth, is data aggregation. So this is a very common pattern or problem we see when we talk to companies out there where they're emitting a ton. And this is in particular for metric data, but this can be applied to other data types as well, is that people generally emit a ton of data, and the data has a lot of dimensions on it. And it makes a lot of sense because you do want to slice and dice your data by those dimensions at a certain point in time. So, you can imagine when you're looking at a latency, you don't just want to see the overall latency of an application. You may want to break it down by the latency between your various clusters or your various data centers or regions and things like that, and compare those. You may want to break down the latency by the types of users that are requesting this particular service there. You can imagine there are many ways that you want to slice and dice this data, because when something goes wrong, you want to use that slicing and dicing to pinpoint what is it really affecting, where is it going wrong. So it's these dimensions or pivots are hugely advantageous for folks. Yet you can imagine they also produce a lot of data, because for each different pivot you have, it produces so much more additional data. And what we find is that a lot of this gets produced. So there's a lot of these pivots, and all of the pivots are generally on all of the data. However, when people go to read this data, so you can imagine perhaps you have, let's say, a million unique pieces of data that you are producing, because it's the combination of all of these pivots. But when you go to read the data, nobody ever actually reads all million. Like, it's actually impossible for a human to process a million lines on a graph. So what often happens is that as we're trying to read the data, we're doing something to it, we're transforming it or aggregating it before it becomes human consumable, right? So, perhaps we're doing a sum or an average across all of that data set, or we're picking the P90 of that data set, something that's going to reduce the data set down to something that is more human readable and understandable, and reducing the data set. And what's interesting is that, there's a huge amount of data that gets produced, and there's a little bit that gets read. What's interesting is that we know exactly how you're going to read the data, because you can imagine users have configured their dashboards and their alerts to know which views of the data they're interested in. And if they don't have a dashboard or alert for it, they're generally not interested in the other views of the data that weren't created, right? So if you knew the views of the data that you want, this is another way to optimize for the outcome, is if you always want the sum.